Episode 35, titled Recon Enum Output Interpretation Drills, we're going to focus on a skill that quietly separates strong test takers from overwhelmed ones, reading outputs quickly and turning data into decisions. Pentest Plus scenarios often present small slices of recon or enumeration output and then ask what you should do next, and the right answer usually comes from interpretation discipline, not from memorizing tool specifics. Outputs are just evidence, and evidence is only valuable when you can categorize it, assess confidence, and select the smallest next action that increases certainty under constraints. This episode is structured like a set of mental drills because speed comes from repetition, not from hoping you'll think clearly on test day. We're going to practice a workflow you can apply to any output type, from port lists to web paths to identity clues. The goal is to make your internal narration crisp and defensible so you stop being surprised by outputs and start using them as a guide.
A simple interpretation workflow can be described as observe, categorize, and choose the next action. And this three-step rhythm is the foundation of every drill we'll do. Observe means read what is actually present in the output without adding extra assumptions, because most misreads start with filling in gaps too aggressively. Categorize means decide what kind of evidence you have, such as reachability, service exposure, boundary behavior, or potential leakage, and then label it as high signal or low signal. Choose next action means select the smallest, safest follow-up that reduces uncertainty or advances the objective, rather than escalating into broad activity. This workflow is deliberately simple because in exam conditions you need something you can run in seconds. It also creates consistency, which makes your reasoning easier to explain and less likely to drift into guesswork. When you practice this rhythm, outputs stop feeling like random noise and start feeling like structured cues.
High signal findings are the ones that tend to change priority immediately because they point to meaningful exposure or likely access pathways. Exposed logins are high signal because identity surfaces are the gate to most impact and often contain the most bypass-prone weaknesses, especially when resets or legacy paths exist. Admin ports or management surfaces are high signal because they concentrate privileged control, and misconfiguration there often has high blast radius. Secrets and artifacts are high signal because they can enable authentication or trust directly and require urgent containment and careful handling. High signal does not mean exploit now. It means this deserves careful, controlled attention first. The exam often uses these signals to see whether you prioritize correctly rather than chasing whatever looks most technical. When you can identify high-signal items quickly, you reduce decision time and increase accuracy.
Low-signal noise is the opposite category. It looks like information, but it is often transient, duplicated, or misleading, and treating it as proof wastes time. Transient errors are low signal because they can reflect timing, load, or network conditions rather than actual exposure, and they often need confirmation before you treat them as meaningful. Duplicate hosts or repeated entries are low signal when they represent the same underlying asset appearing multiple times, and the risk is that you overcount coverage or think you found something new. Misleading banners are low signal because intermediaries and configuration can distort identity clues, and a banner string alone rarely justifies strong conclusions. The exam often tests whether you can recognize low signal noise by offering answer choices that leap to conclusions from shaky evidence. The professional move is to record noise, label it as uncertain, and choose a small confirmation step rather than letting it steer your plan. When you learn to downweight low signal cues, your workflow becomes calmer and more efficient. Confidence language is how you keep your reasoning honest, and it can be summarized as confirmed, likely, and uncertain, each with a different burden of evidence. Confirmed means you have direct observation that supports the statement, such as an open service response or a reachable route that behaves consistently under the same conditions. Likely means multiple clues point in the same direction, such as a banner hint plus a behavior pattern plus a naming convention that align, but you still acknowledge that inference could be wrong. Uncertain means the evidence is ambiguous, inconsistent, or filtered, and you cannot responsibly claim more without additional confirmation. The exam rewards this discipline because it prevents overclaiming, and it also improves next step selection because uncertainty naturally calls for small, clarifying actions. When you label confidence correctly, you stop writing a story and start writing an evidence trail. That evidence trail is what supports safe decisions and credible reporting.
Constraints change interpretation because the same output can mean different things depending on scope limits and safety rules in the scenario. If scope is narrow, a discovered host outside that boundary is not a new target. It is a scope question that requires escalation, documentation, or avoidance. If safety rules emphasize production stability, a high-signal finding does not justify aggressive probing, and the next action should often be low-impact confirmation or escalation rather than deep testing. If time windows are tight, your interpretation should prioritize high-value, high-confidence leads rather than chasing ambiguous noise. Constraints also influence how you handle evidence because sensitive environments demand minimum necessary data collection and careful redaction even during enumeration. Pentest Plus questions often include constraints as short phrases, and missing them is a common reason people misinterpret outputs.
When you incorporate constraints into your interpretation, your best next step choices become more consistent with professional practice. Common misreads tend to cluster around assumptions that feel natural but are wrong under exam logic. Assuming access is a major misread because seeing an open port or a reachable route does not mean you can authenticate, authorize, or perform privileged actions. Confusing filtered with closed is another misread because filtered implies uncertainty and often indicates controls rather than absence, and treating it as absence creates blind spots. Ignoring context is a third misread because outputs must be interpreted in the environment described, including production sensitivity, monitoring, and scope boundaries. Another misread is treating version hints as exploitability, which skips validation and can lead to wrong next actions. The exam uses these misreads by offering answers that sound decisive but are based on assumption rather than evidence. When you can name these misreads, you can avoid them quickly during drills. Now walk a drill scenario, interpreting a port list and proposing next steps because this is one of the most common output patterns on the exam. Imagine you see a host with a small set of open ports, one suggesting an authentication entry point and another suggesting a management surface, plus a couple of filtered ports that hint at control boundaries. First, observe exactly what is present and resist the urge to label a specific product from a single hint. Next, categorize the authentication and management surfaces are high signal, the filtered results are uncertainty with a control implication, and anything ambiguous should be labeled uncertain. Then choose the next action. Select a low-impact service identification step that confirms what the high-signal ports actually represent and record the behavior that supports your inference, while noting that filtered results may need cautious follow-up if they align with objectives. If the scenario includes strict safety constraints, the next step might be documentation and controlled confirmation rather than deeper probing. The key is that the next step is small and clarifying, not broad and aggressive, because your goal is increased certainty and defensible evidence. That is how a port list becomes a plan. Now do a second drill interpreting a web path list and prioritizing targets, because enumeration often produces far more paths than you can test deeply. Imagine you have a list that includes a login route, an account route, an upload route, an export-like route, and an admin-like route, along with many low-value content pages. First, observe what the list contains without assuming that the admin-like name is actually exposed or privileged. Next, categorize authentication and account workflows are high signal, upload and export areas are high impact surfaces, and admin-like routes are high sensitivity leads that require cautious confirmation of boundaries. Then choose Next Actions. Prioritize mapping authentication boundaries and role behavior around these high-value routes using controlled confirmation that records what requires login and what reveals information through redirects or status behavior. Low-value content routes are noise unless they connect to sensitive workflows, so they are deprioritized until high-value areas are mapped. The exam rewards this prioritization because it reflects value-based thinking, not path count obsession. When you can do this quickly, web outputs become manageable rather than overwhelming.
A third drill involves interpreting identity clues and inferring likely weak points, because identity outputs are often subtle and easy to misread. Imagine you observe that one login flow returns different messages depending on whether a user exists, while another flow returns consistent generic responses. And you also observe that the reset path has fewer verification steps than the main login. First, observe the behaviors and separate what you saw from what you suspect, because identity clues require careful confidence labeling. Next, categorize. Differential responses are a leakage clue that increases likelihood, and a weaker reset flow is a bypass risk clue that can undermine strong primary authentication. Then choose the next action. Confirm the behavior with a small, controlled set of observations, map where the flow exists, and record the steps and constraints so you can recommend a fix without implying compromise. If multi-factor appears inconsistently, that inconsistency becomes a high-signal governance issue that should be documented and prioritized. The exam often wants you to choose safe validation and clear reporting rather than aggressive testing, especially around identity. When you interpret identity clues this way, you reduce mistakes and improve prioritization. A quick win strategy across all drills is to pick the smallest next test that increases certainty, because certainty is what converts outputs into defensible conclusions. Small tests are safer, create less noise, and make it easier to interpret results because you are changing one variable at a time. This also aligns with time pressure, because broad actions can produce more data than you can interpret and can introduce operational risk. The exam rewards small, clarifying steps because they reflect controlled professional behavior, especially when constraints emphasize safety. Small tests also make reporting cleaner because you can tie a conclusion to a specific observation with a clear chain of reasoning. When you adopt smallest test that increases certainty as a habit, you become more efficient without becoming reckless. That habit is what turns drills into intuition. Verbalizing reasoning is another discipline that prevents mistakes, because clear logic exposes hidden assumptions before they become wrong answers. When you can say, "This is confirmed," "This is likely," and "This is uncertain," you naturally stop yourself from making leaps. When you can state, "This constraint changes what I can do next," you prevent yourself from selecting an option that violates scope or safety. Verbalizing also helps you avoid getting seduced by tool or technique names because you remain focused on outcomes and evidence. The exam is effectively asking you to verbalize internally, even if you never speak, because the best answer is the one that follows the cleanest chain of reasoning. If you practice verbalizing during study, you will do it automatically during the test. Clear logic is a safety rail for your brain under time pressure.
The mini-review for the drill method is simply observe, categorize, confirm, decide, because those 4 words capture the interpretation flow cleanly. Observe means read what is present without assumptions, including the environment context and constraints. Categorize means label signals as high value or low noise and determine what kind of evidence each item represents. Confirm means choose a small, controlled step that increases certainty when evidence is ambiguous, rather than escalating to broad actions. Decide means select the next action that best fits phase, constraints, and objectives, and record it in a way you can explain later. This is the rhythm you want to run automatically on exam day because it converts outputs into defensible decisions quickly. The words are short, but the discipline behind them is what matters. When you can repeat them, you can apply them to any output.
In this episode, the drill method is to read outputs quickly by observing what is present, categorizing signal versus noise, labeling confidence honestly, and choosing the smallest next action that increases certainty under constraints. High-signal findings like exposed logins, admin surfaces, and discovered secrets should be prioritized carefully, while low-signal noise like transient errors and misleading banners should be recorded but not overtrusted. Constraints such as scope boundaries and safety rules shape interpretation and can turn a technical lead into a pause and escalate moment. Practice port list drills, web path drills, and identity clue drills by turning each into a short statement of what is confirmed, what is likely, and what is uncertain, followed by a safe next step.
Now practice with one imaginary output in your head by naming the key observations, labeling confidence, and stating the smallest next test you would take, because that single rehearsal is how you build speed.
When you can do that consistently, recon and enumeration outputs stop being intimidating and start being a structured advantage on Pentest Plus.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.